Hello everyone, here's a new educational chess game. I have the white pieces, and I start with the pawn to d4. I'm playing against an opponent rated 1803. He replies with d6. I'm going to play knight to f3, so the move d6 is rather passive because it gives me space. I'll then be able to play e4 or c4. For now, I've played knight to f3 to counter the push to e5. He plays knight to f6. I'm going to play the pawn to c4. Then knight to c3 and the push to e4, if he lets me, of course. That way, I'll have a trio of pawns in the center to control the space. He plays g6, he wants to fianchetto the bishop to g7. I play e4, he's probably going to castle kingside, and in the end he's played what's called the King's Indian defense. That means he's given me the center, but he's developed his kingside quickly so that he has time to counterattack in the center since I haven't castled yet. So now, I'm going to face some attacking moves against my center. I play bishop to e2 to prepare for kingside castling. Bishop to d3 is not as good because it allows bishop to g4, pinning the knight on f3 and exposing the d4 pawn. Because the bishop on d3 blocks the queen's protection of the d4 pawn, and specifically the d4 pawn can be attacked by moves like knight to c6, by the bishop, by the e5 push, or by the c5 push. That's why I wanted to keep the queen protecting d4. So the bishop went to e2. Now, he plays e5. It might look like I'm winning a pawn, but in reality that's not possible. If I take on e5 and he recaptures, even if I exchange queens and then take on e5, my knight on e5 would be targeted by his bishop on g7. He would sacrifice his knight on e4 because he knows that afterwards the bishop could take the knight on e5. So when black plays e5 here, you can't really win the pawn. You can push d5 or castle. For now, I'm going to choose to castle, and I wait for the knight to come to c6 before pushing d5. And if black takes on d4, well, the knight recaptures and I get the semi-open d file against the semi-open e file. But as you can see, he plays knight to c6, so I push d5. We are in the theoretical moves of the King's Indian defense. For now, it's a theoretical opening. The knight usually comes to e7. And here, it's interesting because you need to understand the pawn structure. You have to identify the leading pawn for both players. The leading pawn for black is e5. The leading pawn of my pawn chain is the d5 pawn. And the structural evolution happens with the leading duo. That is, for the d5 pawn, I need to manage to place the pawn next to it, the c5 pawn. Obviously, for now, that's not possible. We can look for move like b4 or bishop to e3 to achieve this push to c5. Black must do the same. They identify the pawn on e5, they need to move their knight and play the f5 push. Each side will have to develop on their favorable wing, where they have the space advantage. If I play b4 immediately, it's possible, but I have to be ready for moves like a5, because I won't be able to play a3. He could exchange on b4 and win my rook, which is unprotected. So b4 is certainly possible, but after the move a5, you have to take on a5 and then you need to know how to play. It's not that easy because your opponent will play b6 to try to block the c5 push. There are techniques to break through, but these aren't the lines I usually play. I'm going to play knight to e1. This knight retreat might seem a bit strange, but it's to reposition the knight on d3 with the c5 push. At the same time, I free up my f pawn. This can be useful because when he plays f5, I'll be able to reinforce with f3. In fact, I play f3 right away. When he pushes f5, you're going to see a little surprise. There you go, he plays f5, and now I play a rather rare line. For example, you could play bishop to e3, and after f4, put the bishop on f2, redeploy the knight to d3 for the c5 push. But here, I usually play a rather rare line, which is to push g4. I'm trying to encourage my opponent to push f4 so that the kingside closes and his play on that side is blocked or congested. Then, I redeploy my knight to d3 to support the c5 push. And why not also prepare the b4 push? He could also decide to capture, but capturing opens the file for both players. If he takes on f1, I'm able to recapture. I wouldn't have my rook, but neither would he. So this g4 push, generally, when you play it against King's Indian players, well, it makes them start thinking, and that's exactly what's happening here, as you can see. He played his opening quickly, but now he's pausing, he's thinking it over. He's not used to this g4 move that disrupts his play on the king side. This is a variation that generally frustrates King's Indian defense players. They have trouble figuring out how to play against this g4 push, because here I'm responding on the side where he's attacking me. And that's something they're not used to. They're more used to white playing on the queen side while they play on the king side. So he took on g4, which means he can capture the rook. Now I'm going to recapture with the king to keep the pawn on g4 protected, because as soon as the knight moves, it could attack the g4 pawn. And anyway, my king can easily go back to g2 or g1 without any problem. I also like to keep the g2 square available for the knight. It can go to d3, but also to g2. Sometimes you need it there to control the dark squares and prevent infiltrations, for example, by the opponent's queen. My opponent plays queen to f8, check. So probably king to g1, but king to g2 is also possible. I'm not really sure which is better here. As I mentioned, I prefer to keep the g2 square for the knight. Alright then, I'll play king to g1. I'll stick to what I said earlier. The queen is on the file, but she doesn't have any way to infiltrate. She only has the squares f8, f7, and f6. All the other squares are controlled by white, so she can't go any further. Black could play bishop to h6 to offer an exchange of dark squared bishops, but I have the g5 push which blocks his bishop. And then I can redeploy, for example, by playing knight to d3 or knight to g2, bishop to e3, and come to contest the f-file. You also have to understand that in this pawn structure, there's always a good bishop and a bad bishop. Since my pawns are mostly blocked on white squares, it's the bishop on e2, my light squared bishop, that is the bad one. And for him, since his pawns are mostly blocked on dark squares here, it's his dark squared bishop that is the bad one. So my idea is to prevent his dark squared bishop from being active as much as possible, but also to free my own. Sometimes by pushing g5 and playing bishop to g4 to exchange it for his own light squared bishop, or coming into e6 to attack his king, for example. We can also see that in this position he lacks space, and his knights are struggling to find good squares. So he could still play knight to f6, but he doesn't really attack the g4 pawn, which is defended twice. And besides, after knight to f6, what does he do if I play g5? Because if he goes to h5, I can actually capture twice on h5. If he plays knight to c5, we can immediately push the knight back with the b4 pawn push. He plays bishop to f6. By playing bishop to f6, what is he aiming for? Maybe to put the bishop on h4 to try to get into f2. So here, I could play g5 right away, force his bishop back, and then play bishop to g4. That interests me, but I could also play knight to g2, you see, to prevent the possibility of bishop to h4. But I think I'm going to play g5. Alright, I'll play g5. The bishop defends, his bishop has to retreat, and then bishop to g4. I'm not against exchanging the light squared bishops, as I mentioned before. And my idea is also to develop my pieces so I can then put a rook on f1. So I play bishop to g4. If knight to c5, I can exchange or not actually, because if he takes, that will end up bringing my queen to g4. And do you see how these pieces are all cramped? The bishop on g7 isn't doing anything, the knight on e7 has no squares. And now he plays knight to b6, attacking c4. He offers to exchange the light squared bishops, but I don't mind that exchange. I'm going to play pawn to b3, simply to defend the c4 pawn. And if he takes, the queen recaptures. Then I need to develop the bishop, the knight to d3 or g2, and put the rook on f1. I'm also keeping in mind that my plan will involve pushing c5. But first, I'm going to try to dry up any play he might have on the file, meaning to neutralize all the activity on the file and leave him with a bad dark squared bishop. Even if he has moves like h6, I can play h4. So if he takes on g4, the queen recaptures. Now, he also has to watch out for moves into e6, even though it's not that serious for him, because he can shift over to h8. He offers a queen exchange. I can accept the queen exchange. There are other interesting moves as well. I can play h3. If he takes, I recapture with the pawn. H takes g4. So what does that give me? Maybe not much in the end. I'm also considering queen to e6. Check. If he takes, I recapture. That frees up the d5 square. And if there's a capture, it would allow me to recapture with a pawn and strengthen the protected pass pawn on e6. But I'll just go for the queen exchange. I'm not too sure about the rest. So I play quickly. Actually, I'm playing too quickly. I have plenty of time. It was a 14-minute game with a 3-second increment per move. We had a lot of time, and I could have taken some to really think things through here, you know. I kind of regret playing so fast. I place my bishop on e3. So if he tries the move c6, that will expose the d6 pawn to attacks. In case of an exchange, you see, I might have moved like rook to d1 to attack d6, But after c6, I might also not need to react right away because the d5 pawn is very well protected. He plays knight to d7. Here, he's setting a trap for me, you know. If I take on a7, he'll play b6, and my bishop won't be able to get out. Even if I can protect it with knight to b5, it's still annoying. I'm just going to play knight to d3. I'm controlling the c5 square. He can't get into c5. And maybe this move bishop takes a7, if it's not good now, could become interesting a bit later. For example, if I play a4 and then take on a7, and he plays b6, I can play a5 afterwards to break open the prison he's trying to build for me. So in this position, I still have a space advantage. There's still that bad dark squared bishop. You see the pawn on e5 and the pawn on d6 completely block his diagonals, and the pawn on g5 also prevents him from playing. These knights still don't have any squares to develop to. He plays a6, so he doesn't just leave the pawn on a7 hanging around. You see, he's being cautious. He knows there's that trap of trapping the bishop, but sometimes you can still go take the pawn on a7 and then free yourself afterwards. I could play c5 immediately. I can play rook to c1 to prepare the c5 push, so that it happens under better conditions. I could also play rook to f1 to counter his play on the f file, and encourage him to play rook to f8 and exchange rooks, and then centralize my king, for example. I could also prepare the c5 push by playing b4 first, then c5, and if he takes, recapture with the pawn. I'm going to take a little time to think about what the best options are, because right now I have a lot of options available. I'm also thinking that with the rook on c8, he's going to want to play c6. And I'm looking at rook to d1, because I'm thinking that if he pushes c6, I can take on c6. And then, as soon as I move my knight, I'll be attacking the pawn. Yes, I'm going to go with this idea and play a rook to d1. So, I'm trying to neutralize the c6 push in order to counterattack the backward pawn on d6 after the exchange on c6. Then, I'll improve the position of my king and look to play c5 under good conditions. Maybe with the b4 push, we'll see. He plays rook and runs away. He prevents my king from centralizing, but he loses some possibility of playing c6 with two counterattacks on the c file. On the other hand, his rook is still well placed here. Can it get into the position? It can come in on f3. So I'm going to play king to g2. I could also eventually challenge the rooks and play rook to f1. I think the endgame is still better for me because he still has a bad bishop. So here, I'm hesitating between king to g2 to prevent him from coming in on f3 and playing rook to f1. Alright, I'll play rook to f1. I'm not against exchanging the rooks. I think my advantage mainly lies in the difference between the dark squared bishops, since his is blocked in and I have a space advantage. Since there's an open file, we can definitely exchange the rooks on the open file. He plays king to f7. My idea after b4 and c5 is that if he takes, I recapture with the pawn, and I'll have this pawn duo that will control the space well. So I'll play b4. If he plays a5, I can play a3, and then I'll have the b5 square to attack c7. So it's a very strategic, very technical game, as you can see, all about the squares. It's basically a trench war. We're really advancing square by square, but in a position where I have the space advantage. He plays b6. That doesn't actually stop me from playing c5. Pawn takes, pawn takes, pawn takes, knight takes, bishop takes. And he'll end up with a more fragmented pawn structure than mine. On c5, capture. Capture, for example, knight takes. I'm not obliged to take back with the knight as well. I can take with the bishop and then recapture with the knight afterwards. That could be interesting too. Especially to attack the a6 pawn. So I'm going to push c5. It's hard for him not to take because I'm putting pressure on b6 with the pawn and the bishop, and also on d6. And my knight can maneuver. It can go to b2 and then to c4 to increase the pressure. He might play b5. If he pushes b5, maybe a4, with the knight supporting by the way he plays b5, so we'll see. I'm also considering the move c6, because then the knight will really have very few squares left. The knight comes to f8, And after that, it has no more squares. And if it goes to b8, it's the same. It has no more squares. So let's play c6. So the idea is to follow up with a4. I still have this lever to open up the queenside, because my goal is not to completely block the queenside. I'm depriving the opponent's knights of all their squares. He has a square on b6, but I considered bishop takes b6. After pawn takes, I have a protected passed pawn. That's still a nice asset. Let's exchange. Now, if I play pawn to c7, his knight controls the c8 square, so that's not possible yet. But I'm looking at the move a4. Pawn takes, knight takes, which will come to attack the b6 pawn, allowing my knight to then help control the c8 square, so my pawn can promote. A 4, if pawn takes, knight takes, I attack b6. If he pushes b5, I go into b6. You see? So here, I'm playing against a bad bishop, still the dark square bishop that has no play. But now, I've improved my pawn structure with a protected passed pawn on c6. He has double pawns, so with this push to a4, I'm going to undouble his pawns, but it's to activate my knight. I recapture on a4. He could play knight to c8, to defend b6 again. I hadn't thought of that either, It's passive, but it seems to hold. Can I play knight to b2 and then knight to c4? He'll fork me, but then I could get into b6 afterwards. But anyway, he plays b5 right away. And here, I'm looking at knight to b6, of course, but I'm also considering knight to c5. Why? Because if pawn takes, I can recapture with the pawn and have a lot of pawns, but I think he'll be able to handle it with his pieces. With knight to c5, pawn takes, knight takes, I'll also be able to take his pawn on a6 and maybe get there in time to play knight to c7 and take his pawn on b5. So that's interesting too. I can win a lot of pawns for the piece. But first, can he counter my idea with knight to b6? He's going to bring his king back. And if I play pawn to c7, he can't bring his king back because the knight controls the d7 square. So knight to b6, king to e8, c7, he can't prevent me from queening. He'll have to sacrifice his knight. So knight to b6, I don't see what he's going to do. I don't see it. I'm playing knight to b6. This is the plan I mentioned earlier, with a c5 push that will eventually win on the queenside, thanks to advancing this c-pawn, having locked in the dark squared bishop from the opening. That was the idea behind this position with f3 and g4 to ultimately dry up his attacking chances on the kingside, and then switch back to fight on the queenside, where I have a space advantage and above all, the benefit of an extra piece, since the bishop on g7 can't get into play in this kind of pawn structure when the central pawns are locked on dark squares and block those diagonals. So I'm playing with two free and very mobile pieces. Elsewhere my two knights while he only has one. And on top of that, he has to maneuver with a lack of space. So now he's still thinking. There it is. He sacrifices on c6. So of course I'm going to recapture with the pawn. We played a game with strategic themes that I'm particularly fond of, namely structural play, maneuvering, and weak squares. So here, I take on c6, but I still don't see how he can stop the queen that's about to come in. On king to e8, or king to e7, pawn to c7, and we have the pawn controlling the dark squares, and the knight controlling the light squares working together. That creates a barrier for the black king, who can't get any closer. The dark squared bishop can't play anyway. At this point, it's time for him to resign, because it's inevitable, unavoidable, I'm going to promote to a queen. And there it is, he resigns. The computer gives me 93% accuracy versus 83% for my opponent. Let's analyze. So I played d4, he played d6, knight to f3, knight to f6, and in the end we're heading into a king's Indian defense. He plays g6, knight to c3, bishop to g7, pawn to e4, kingside castle, bishop to e2. He plays a push to e5. So here, as I was saying, I can't win the pawn. If I take on e5, even if I trade queens and win the pawn on e5, I'll get counterattacked with knight takes e4. If I take his knight, he takes mine, and his bishop is very active on the diagonal, and his rook is very active on the file. And if I make the mistake of playing knight takes f7, thinking that if he takes my knight, I'll take his, well, I'll actually end up losing a piece. Black could play bishop takes c3 check, so I wouldn't be able to take his knight anymore. And then he takes mine and I'm down a piece. So in the position after e5, I can't win a pawn. So I castle. Now he plays knight to c6. He attacks the d4 pawn. And now I play d5. The knight moves to e7. I pull mine back to e1 to free up the f pawn. He, on his side, has to play for the f5 push. So he's also going to free up his f pawn. I play f3. He plays f5. And now, the surprise variation, the move g4. This is a line that club-level players don't know very well. Every time I play g4 in this position, every single time, my opponents start thinking. You can really sense that it disrupts their automatic move sequence. They know the position up to this point, but when it comes to the move g4, they don't know what to do. If my opponent pushes f4, I usually play h4 to create a buffer duel. If he plays g5, I counter with h5. And if he plays the pawn to h5, I counter with g5. And if he attacks the pawn on h4 with the queen at some point, I can play knight to g2 to defend it. And even there are bishop retreats to d2, e1, and f2, which will defend the pawn on h4 and support the advance with b4 and c5. Because my idea is to lock down the kingside and then calmly develop on the queenside afterward, just as happened in the game. On the g4 pawn, my opponent captured on g4. I recaptured, he traded rooks, and I decided to take back with the king. He played queen to f8, check. I moved my king to g1. The computer can't decide whether g2 or g1 is the better move. And honestly, I don't know either. Bishop to f6. So here I push g5. The bishop retreats to g7, which allows me to play bishop to g4. And my opponent plays knight to b6. He offers to exchange the light squared bishops. Here I accept the exchange of light squared bishops, but first I play b3 to prevent him from taking my pawn on c4. He takes on g4, and I recapture. And then he plays queen to c8. We could play h3, as I mentioned during the game, and let the queens be exchanged. But here I prefer to exchange the queens myself and continue with bishop to e3. He plays knight to d7, I play knight to d3, and he pushes the pawn to a6. I play rook to d1 to try to counter the c6 push. If he plays c6, I take with the idea of then going to attack d6. If he recaptures with the knight to try to get into d4, supported by the pawn and the bishop, he will no longer protect the d5 square. So I can also bring my own knight into d5. And actually his knight on c6 can't move anymore because of the threat of a fork on e7. In the game, after rook to d1, he came onto the file. I offered the exchange of rooks. He accepted. And now I have an advantage in the position. Granted, it's not a decisive advantage, it's a small edge, but one that puts black in an uncomfortable spot. I haven't won anything, but I have a space advantage. He has pieces that are struggling to find good squares, and I know how to make progress on the queenside. I've already won plenty of games this way on the queenside, because each time black can't find the exact defensive setup to counter white's progress, which is made easier by the space advantage. He plays king to f7. I play the pawn push b4. He plays b6, and I push c5, and here he counter-pushed with b5. If he had exchange in this position, I could recapture with a knight or with a bishop, because I'm not afraid of knight takes. Otherwise, I recapture with a knight, and a 6 is weak. On top of that, I even have the e6 square afterwards to attack c7 or to attack the g7 pawn. But well, the g7 pawn doesn't really interest me in this position, of course. Faced with the c5 push, he didn't take. Instead, he counter-pushed with b5. The pawn continues its advance, c6. If the knight goes to b8 or f8, it has no squares left. Completely trapped in the pawn structure. So he went to b6, but that allows me to exchange and free up the c-pawn. I can't push it right away because I don't control the c8 square yet. That's why I play a4. He takes on a 4, knight takes a 4, and this time I want to go to b6 to secure control of the c8 square. Earlier in the game I mentioned the move knight to c8. He could play that to prevent me from taking the b6 pawn and to keep occupying the blockade square of my passed pawn. And here, the computer showed what needed to be done. By the way, what should be done here? I invite you to pause the video and think about what you would do, how you might continue in this position. What would you do here? What decision should be made? The computer indicates that the best move is to push b5. If black plays a5, we play knight to b2 with the idea of then coming to c4 and doubling the pressure on the b6 pawn. And if black captures on b5, we play knight to c3. The knight on d3 controls the b4 square, and the knight on c3 will take the pawn on b5. And that's winning. If black plays, for example, king to e8, we will capture on b5. If they play, for example, bishop to f8, we play knight to b4, king to d8, knight to a6. We can clearly see that in this position, the black pieces are trapped. The knight has no squares, and neither does the bishop on f8. The king is on the defensive. And now, since both knights control the c7 square, I'll be able to play knight to c7, then bring the knight back to e6. And already, this position will create multiple threats. I can also maneuver, try to bring my king in to support the push on h5, or simply bring my king towards b5, so that he too becomes an attacker of b6. And my knight on b5, I could reposition it, for example, to c4 to attack the weaknesses on b6 and d6. There are plenty of ways to progress in this position. In any case, black is completely trapped. But my opponent didn't play knight to c8, as you know. He played b5, so I play knight to b6. And then he sacrificed his knight on c6, but that doesn't change anything. In any case, the c-pawn will be able to promote to a queen. If he takes on c6, the pawn recaptures, and in any case, I'll be able to promote to a new queen, so he ended up resigning rather quickly. So I hope this video was either instructive or entertaining. We'll meet again soon for new adventures on the chessboard. Don't forget to give me a thumbs up, leave comments, share the video, or support the channel. Goodbye everyone.